Got it. Okay, we are live. And hopefully, if anyone, if you can't hear me, type in the channel. The Zoom link is as usual right here. I assume we're streaming. Do you want a video in the corner of your face? Okay. Doug is here to do a guest speech today, so we're going to start with that. Great, thank you, Linda. Okay.
All good?
Yep.
Thanks, Linda.
There you go.
Cool, thanks.
Cool. So give it like 3-4 minutes. Yeah, just 5 to 8.
And this is the mic here, obviously.
Yeah, so you might walk around a little bit, do your thing. Obviously, your keys.
How's everything else? I was talking to Steve about it. He's like, yeah, for the
Doug, I'm just gonna move your stuff over here just for students. But it's still way cheaper than Texas. Way fewer errors, way fewer errors. Yeah, we have so Just remember to make the announcement.
Yeah, you got it. Hey guys, how's everybody doing?
The guest speaker today.
Guest speaker.
Great.
Enthusiasm. Guys, real quick, like one thing before we get into talk. So I've reviewed probably about half of your resumes, I would say, at this point, and they're looking good and coming together nicely, which is great. One thing I've been kind of like thinking a little bit more about is, you know, if I'm putting on my employer hat, the thing I'm going to want to see the most is like a project that you've worked on, i.e. the capstone. So like unequivocally, like I think that's unequivocally going to be your most valuable asset for employers to share with them. So I just wanted to really highlight that. And in fact, I know with some of you we talked about, you know, have your GitHub profile upper left, or you know, highlight those projects, right? And so that capstone will be like well suited for that type of feedback. Any thoughts or questions on that before we get into the deck? Cool. Okay.
Actually, I do have a question.
Yeah.
Where would you, like, if you were listing projects, where would you put that at the end?
Yeah, I've seen people do it different ways, but I've seen people have like a projects section. So like they'll have experience, or some people actually lead with it. It depends, I guess. But more often than not, what I'll see is like experience, projects, education, kind of like in that. But I think so long as it's there and you make it highlighted, you'll be in good shape. But that will be like the first thing people will look at. That is probably your GitHub profile. Okay, guys. So blockchain stuff. So my goal with this deck is to kind of focus on a couple things, but so blockchain it's kind of intense and hard to explain. You get low level into the technical weeds, so we'll try to keep it high level. And at that point, it's still a little bit hard to explain. So definitely flag me down if I'm saying stuff that doesn't make any sense. So we'll start with kind of the history behind this technology, like where it came from and why it exists. And then I'll segue into how we're using it and kind of our story behind how we got involved in this space. So you guys know me at this point, but as you guys know, I wear kind of two professional hats, right? The Hack Upstate side, and then of course, Upstate Interactive, the software consultancy. So Upstate Interactive, we're a software consultancy that specializes in custom enterprise software. So we work traditionally with larger clients that need to beef up their engineering teams or need help building a product from end to end. So they'll bring us on board and we'll help them out on those fronts. Most of that work is traditional web development, so things you guys are learning here today. But a portion of it, we just did a breakdown the other day, just about 20% of our business is the blockchain side. So it's certainly the minority piece of the business. Okay, so this Cypherpunks. So this is where the genesis for blockchain kind of originated. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, there was this group of primarily academics based in San Francisco, Silicon Valley. There are a few in Europe as well. But they were all cryptologists. Are you guys all familiar with cryptography, encryption at a high level, like what that's about, right? So it's basically creating codes and encrypting things so they can be masked and then ultimately unencrypted so someone can reveal a secret message, right? So these cypherpunks were, they specialized in cryptography. But at the same time, many of these folks were some would argue, radical libertarians. So very much in the vein of not believing in fiat currency printed by nation states and that sort of thing. So a lot of the momentum behind blockchain kind of started with this group, and there's a lot of interesting archives, communications between these folks. It's really fascinating to look through. 25, 30 years later. But this is kind of the genesis for how this all started. These conversations amongst these cryptographers, primarily based in Silicon Valley. So fast forward to 2008, October, and the Bitcoin whitepaper is released by one of these cypherpunks, this person named Satoshi Nakamoto. Today, we have no idea who that is. It's a pseudonym. We don't know who that person is, which is crazy to think about, right? But they released this white paper that breaks down this notion of blockchain, which we hadn't yet heard of. And blockchain being this tool to instill trust in the transactions of currency from peer to peer. So we don't have an intermediary. We don't have banks that we're relying on. Instead, I can transact directly with you, Eva. You can transact directly with me, and then we can trust that transaction. So the Bitcoin white paper centered on that, and he poses using this blockchain technology, again, that no one had heard of, as a solution to do that. And of course, from the abstract, his goal, a purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. One thing I would note too is, so the white paper came out in October. I think Bitcoin was ultimately released a few months later. I want to say January of 2009. And it was like, this is right in the throes of the financial collapse, right? All these banks are defaulting, and we're realizing what's happening here with Bear Stearns. And
the first block of Bitcoin is based on a headline which says like Chancellor on the verge of the second bailout.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's sort of a commentary.
Yeah, I think it was from the Financial Times or some outlet, but you're right. In the very first block in the Bitcoin blockchain, there's this kind of cryptic note, if you will, that pulled the headline with regards to these bailouts, right?
Prove it was on that day, but yes.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. But fascinating little anecdote in this space. So what are the benefits of Bitcoin? So first off, it's a decentralized currency versus centralized. So you're gonna hear me hammer this one a few times, but this notion of us on a network being able to transact amongst ourselves and to trust these transactions whether it's monetary, i.e. Bitcoin, or data related, without a centralized intermediary that says, yep, that's cool, you can do that. So like a bank, like an attorney, like a CPA, right, where we have to rely on these centralized bodies to kind of say, yep, this is trusted, this transaction can happen. No state manipulation, right? Nobody owns this currency, right? It's a network of people and people with Bitcoin. The United States federal government can't intervene. Germany, the EU can't intervene, right? This is outside of their realm. So they can't just print more Bitcoin, right? And lead to hyperinflation as we've seen in some other places. But I think that's pretty powerful, right? There's this autonomous currency that's kind of operating amongst peers. Censorship resistant. So this circles back to this notion that we don't have a centralized party that can dictate or influence what we can and can't transact with, right? So today, if I were to try to buy something with my Amex that was perhaps questionable, Amex might flag it and say, no, you can't buy that. Conversely, if I were to use Bitcoin, no problem. So it's censorship resistant in that sense. So have you guys heard of Silk Road? About 8 years ago, maybe less than that. So Silk Road was essentially this e-commerce site where you could buy and sell and transact anything. So all sorts of drugs. It's still out there on the dark net, and there's a bunch of other ones. And they all use Bitcoin because it is censorship resistant. And what's interesting is, so when this first started gaining momentum, maybe 2011, 12, 13, everyone thought Bitcoin was used for just buying drugs, right? Because everyone's doing that on Silk Road. So it was good from a PR standpoint in that it got more people talking about Bitcoin, but bad in that it was negative PR. But in any event, they were ahead of the curve in terms of like using it for that type of that use case. Trust. So fundamentally, with all of these blockchain technologies, it's all about trust. It basically introduces trust as a construct to programming. We can bake that into our tools now, where we can trust that certain transactions, certain executions of computer code are in fact happening, being validated on a network, and we can verify that. We don't need to rely on those third-party intermediaries that I mentioned earlier. Quick payments. How many of you guys have tried to like wire money to Europe before? It's a pain. Like it's such a nightmare. You're dealing with multiple banks. It can take weeks. I've had it take a couple weeks in the past. Yeah, it's a nightmare. Conversely, Bitcoin, if I want to pay a vendor or something, a couple minutes, no big deal.
Not to mention shady governments.
Oh,
My father was from the Soviet Union, and he wanted to send, as a kid, he always wanted to send money to them, but he never, they could change the rules, they would just take it.
Take a fee, they'll call the shots, right? Because you're going through this intermediary.
Oh, but that was actually, they were in East Germany, couldn't send them anything.
Yeah. So conversely, with these types of technologies, we can transact amongst ourselves. We don't need that. User anonymity. So we can protect our identities and send this stuff without people actually knowing who we are. There's some cases where you can kind of track someone down a little bit depending on circumstances, but for the most part, it's pretty anonymous. And this last piece, with Bitcoin in particular, there's a finite supply. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins ever. I think right now today there might be like 18 million that exist or 19 that are in circulation. And over the next however many years, we'll mint the rest of them, but we'll never see more than that. So you can't print more of these things. You don't have to worry about inflation in that regard. So that's powerful in that sense. Not all cryptocurrencies have a finite amount like that. Many do, but Bitcoin in particular is like the well-known one at 21 million. Any questions on that stuff?
Well, I'm just curious, how do you trust people that you don't know?
Yeah, that's what we're gonna get into. Perfect timing. Good setup question. Okay, so this is the part where I've been in this space now for probably like 2 years, maybe a little less, and I still have trouble explaining how this works under the hood, even at a high level. So definitely like let me know if this isn't making sense, because it can take a little time to kind of wrap your arms around it. So in essence, it starts out with a transaction. Eva, I want to send you 5 Bitcoin or whatever. What happens with that transaction is a block is created where that transaction is placed in it. Some blockchains, they'll have hundreds of transactions in a single block. Others will just be a single transaction. Bitcoin, I forget what the limit is, but there's only so many transactions you can fit in a particular block. But I want to send Eva this money. A block's created with that transaction to note that that's happening. And then that block is sent and shared to everybody else that's running a node on the network. So what does that mean, a node on the network? Have you guys heard of these folks called miners in the Bitcoin space, and they're just magically mining Bitcoin? So those are the nodes on the network. They're essentially the ones that are validating transactions on our behalf. So what they're doing is they have these beefed up servers that are doing all sorts of crazy computations on essentially a complex math puzzle over a condensed period of time. And the particular miner that wins and solves that puzzle first is the one to solidify that block with our transaction on the blockchain. Okay? And then what happens is all the rest of the nodes or the miners say, oh, Doug did send that money to Eva. It's been validated. It's been verified. I'll verify it too. And they all keep track of this history of all of these transactions, every single one from the second Bitcoin was released in 2009 up until now. They have that entire transaction history in a ledger. You got a question?
Yeah, well, what happens if they don't solve the problem?
That's a good question. And I've never seen that. I've never heard that asked before, and I don't even know if it's possible, honestly. But so this gets into like the nitty gritty of math. It's my understanding that these are all solvable within like a 10-minute threshold, or there's some like threshold of time. But to be honest with you, I should look into that more because that's a great question. I don't know the answer to it. But to date, they've always been solved.
I think they all call back to like realizing it's been so long since one got solved, so the problem difficulty automatically ticks down. I think that's how it works.
That would make sense.
The difficulty ticks up and down depending on how fast they're being solved.
Oh, I didn't know
That's
that.
part of it.
Yeah, I didn't know that. So that's good to know. Very cool. So they kind of keep you in that threshold. I think with Bitcoin in particular, it takes about 10 minutes for each block to be produced.
Yeah. So
they probably use that time limit, like, okay, we got to reduce the difficulty of this crazy complex math problem. So then all the nodes are validating these transactions. I think a piece of this too, so noting that like they're keeping track of the history of the entire blockchain, right? Every single transaction. We're talking millions and millions and millions. So there's no way to go back and change something that happened. I can't go back 20 blocks and change me sending you 5 Bitcoin, right? I can't go back and do that because all the rest of the nodes will say, no way. Like we've already validated this happened 20 blocks ago. Doug, you already sent that money to Eva. It belongs to Eva now. There's no going back. So these things are immutable in that sense, right? And that solves the key piece of this Bitcoin puzzle or this crypto puzzle, this notion of the double spend problem. So if we weren't validating in this sense, I could essentially send you that 5 Bitcoin. I could double spend it and send Jesse that 5 Bitcoin. So by this blockchain or this transaction history that's with all these validations combats against that.
You can do it within that 10-minute window.
I'm sorry?
If you did it before the problem got solved, then what?
If you double spend before the
Yeah.
So it'll still, because these blocks, there's going to be transactions and histories in there. So if I sent you 5, it would deduct that from my ledger. If I send you 5, it would deduct that from the ledger. But it would still have those transactions and those histories in that block. So it's not as though I could get away with double spending before a block's generated, if that makes sense.
But if you if you were trying to scam us,
yeah,
right, and you sent simultaneously to like all of us 5 Bitcoin,
yeah,
and it took a few minutes for it to get validated,
yeah,
so you got whatever we gave you for the 5 Bitcoin.
Okay.
You shouldn't send him what he's giving you the Bitcoin for until it gets validated, for sure.
But then why would I send?
But a lot of times it's automated too. Yeah.
You gotta,
One of us could scam the other. I just think the whole thing is. Go ahead. I don't mean to be that person.
There's a case where like the people will disagree on which spending happened.
Yep.
And in that case, there's 2 competing blocks which have incompatible data. There's no way to have that spent in 2 places in the same consistent history.
Okay.
But what happens is whoever mines that history and then blocks after that,
yep,
basically the longer of the block, the longer of the history wins. And everybody agrees that that's how it works. So one of them will eventually become adopted by most of the miners. It just works, yeah.
So this is,
But does it? Like, how would they know if you
Yeah.
sent?
so this is where you're raising great questions, and we'll find ourselves like going deep in the weeds. Like you were already going on a path I was going to avoid going down.
I don't really understand it far beyond the blockchain forks, and then the longer fork actually always
Yeah.
wins. And because of the proof of work, you can't bake a longer fork
Yeah.
without having an enormous amount of computing power.
Yeah, you're exactly right, but
Yeah.
we'll avoid going down that path. But you're spot on. So trust that it works.
There's
Okay.
yeah, there's specifics
It's magic,
about
it's
all of
working.
that, And I don't know
Yeah.
how.
But I'm happy to sit down with you and we can drill.
Yeah, I'm very curious about it because I read about it a lot and don't really understand. I mean, I read
Yeah.
what goes on, like that guy in Canada, wasn't there a guy in Canada who was gone with like 118 million in investments? Like, you know, sometimes I hear bits and pieces of like radio shows, so I don't
Yeah.
exactly remember.
Yeah, that's one of these things
Because I don't
too.
live far away. So I'm like, oh. But,
Yeah.
yeah, anyway, go ahead.
Okay, so these miners that are validating these nodes, or excuse me, these nodes of miners that are validating these transactions in these blocks, why would they do that, right? It costs a lot of money to pay for all this computing processing power. So the reason their incentive and why they're motivated to get this agreement and consensus going is because they get rewarded in Bitcoin for doing it. So after they validate a block, and so I'm the miner that wins that crazy math puzzle, I solve it before all of you guys, I get rewarded with X number of Bitcoin. That's why I do it. So there's these crazy mathematical models that determine what people pay for electricity and servers and blah, 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 relative to the likelihood that they get Y number of Bitcoin. And it's pretty complex when you go down that path and try to go and create a mining business. Okay, so then the block is added to the top of the blockchain, and the transaction, i.e. me sending you 5 Bitcoin, is complete. Any other questions about this? Sure.
Okay, so it's distributed, right?
Yeah.
Who do you send your transactions to?
Good question. So we all have unique addresses, okay? People call them wallets sometimes. So it's like this long string of characters. I forget how many bytes, but essentially I'm sending my Bitcoin to your address, to your wallet. So when I initiate that transaction, I would send it to you. And then
But who do you tell that you're sending?
Right, sorry, that's more what I
To
meant.
his.
oh, so you'll have a wallet with a GUI, a UI, and you can actually see like what's in there, right? So you can see, oh, I have 5 Bitcoin. And Doug.
Sorry, I mean like the block itself. How do miners know that there's a new transaction in the block to start mining?
Right, let's post it to the ledger.
Oh, good question. Okay, so you can only fit so many transactions in a block. With Bitcoin, I forget what the memory allocation is. In Ethereum, it's different too. So once they approach that threshold, it's my understanding, and I don't know how this works to be honest with you under the hood, but like a trigger is initiated, right? Like, okay, this block's full. We gotta validate it. I don't know what triggers that or how that works, to be honest with you, but that's a great question, and I should look into that.
What's the difference between blockchain and
We'll,
Ethereum? Is there a difference?
we'll get there. Good questions. All right, Theorem, you keep teeing me up perfectly.
I'll take my 5 Bitcoin.
Yeah,
You're
man.
ready.
Hey, bud. Yeah, cool.
That was nice.
Yeah, that was nice, you guys. Feel free to go get pizza. I can keep talking, so just go ahead.
Dream up more questions.
So fast forward to 2013. That's when the Ethereum white paper is released by this like genius kid out of Toronto, Vitalik Buterin. And Vitalik wrote this like really crazy in-depth computer science white paper about the notion of building a distributed global computer in which we can all share the resources of that computer and validate who's doing what using the blockchain, right? So that's kind of a crazy concept to wrap your arms around. But think of Anna's computer, and we're all sharing those same resources, but it's globally shared. So really, in fact, think of it this way. There's one computer in this room, and it's using all of our memory and all of our processing power. And we're all sharing that one computer, even though it's really 9, 12 laptops here. So what he did was essentially say, okay, we can do that in order to validate and verify who's using what resources and to create constraints around who has to pay for what. We'll use the blockchain for that means. 2 years later, Vitalik and his team deployed it to mainnet.
Is that his real name?
Vitalik, yeah,
That is his real
he's Russian heritage, but Russian Canadian. I forget what I know he's from Toronto. So what are the benefits of Ethereum? It's open source. It's public, so we can all look at and validate and verify and trust the code. It's distributed, or a distributed computing platform, just like I mentioned, right? We're all sharing these computer resources together on our global computer. And it's a global distributed operating system. We're all sharing. It's all using that same operating system, the same resources. It's immutable and secure. So immutable in that we can't go back and change things, other transactions in the blockchain. There's no single point of failure, right? It's not just one server that we could DDoS and knock offline, because we're all running nodes on Ethereum. But similar in that they have miners as well. And here's the thing that our team loves to play around with is these smart contracts. So smart contracts run on this distributed computer, and they basically have rule sets that we have to conform to, and you can't break. So think of them as applications, like a web app that's running on the internet. In this case, a smart contract's running on the Ethereum blockchain. So how do smart contracts work? They're essentially agreements between people or between computers in the form of code, right? Where there's no going back. So I kind of think about it this way. So right now I'm in the midst of buying a house, and it's a nightmare because there's all of these intermediaries. It sucks, right? Like our attorney, their attorney, our real estate agent, their real estate agent, our lender, whoever else they got on their side. And it's inspector and everybody, right? There's always parties involved. And we have to abide by their rule sets because we need these centralized parties because we trust them, right? We trust them. Conversely, what if we did this? What if I wanted to buy a house from you, Eva? We didn't want to deal with all that, right? All that money, all that trouble. Let's just communicate amongst ourselves. But we still need a layer of trust, so I know you won't screw me over and I won't screw you over. Right? So we could use smart contracts for that, right? We could have these rule sets baked in. So Doug gets inspection, Eva signs off. On to the next phase. Eva applies for mortgage application, bank signs off. But in this case, it wouldn't be a bank, right? It would be Doug validating that you have what you say you have, and then you're putting the down payment down. So that's how smart contracts work, right? They can eliminate those intermediaries and instead let us interact with and transact amongst ourselves in a trusted way without them. It's different than Bitcoin in that with Bitcoin's like a store of value, right? It's like a currency. Conversely, this could be data or transactions for those rule sets, right? For abiding by the closing of the house and making sure we conform to those rules. And then we go through that process in a trusted way. So I kind of skipped around a little bit, but at a high level, does that sort of kind of make sense? Like,
so similar, it works similar to Bitcoin in the sense that it's the same idea that you can't, there's no take back fees.
No take back fees. I love that. No take back fees.
I don't know how else to put it, but that's
yeah, it's immutable, right? No take back fees.
Yeah.
It's a blockchain, right? So we all trust those transactions have been validated.
When you find out that your trust was misplaced, which invariably people do.
Oh yeah.
Then what? You're screwed.
Yeah, and trust me, people have lost millions and millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And sometimes it's a hack, sometimes it's a bug in the smart contract code. It could be a bunch of things. And so these things are risky, particularly today, and they're high value targets, right? Because some of these smart contracts are processing millions and millions and millions of dollars. So if I put my hacker hat on and I know that this smart contract is processing that kind of money, I'm going to go after it. I'm going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out if it has a vulnerability that I can take advantage of. So there's high risk in that sense for sure. And we've seen
even in the house example, I could stage my house to look.
Oh yeah.
Like if we pass inspection and then take everything back out.
You're right, and
those
those.
To be a prosecutor, so I think the worst.
Yeah, and you're right in that. So what Ethereum's not good at yet is those transactions that rely on real world things, right? Like you staging your house and me seeing, it looks great, but I don't realize that your roof's about to collapse.
The house inspector would have to have some kind of cryptographic keys that says I can prove I'm a house inspector, and the contract is contingent on what I say.
Yep.
That'd be the only way to do it.
Yeah, you could bake that in, but then I need to
It would
verify.
have to all be simultaneous, so you couldn't take out that branding part that you put in.
or it could just be like a step-by-step thing. But you're exactly right. Like maybe there's a different role for an individual that's baked into the smart contract, and then we have to verify their certificate.
Right.
So you can do whatever you need to with these things, but it can get complex and it can get a little messy under the hood. Okay, so any other questions about blockchain stuff before I transition into kind of like our story and how we got into it? And again, I'm happy to sit down with you guys and then dive into this deeper if you'd like at any time. So just hit me up on Slack and we'll make it happen. By the way, during this, I just got a spam call from GoDaddy. Dude, all the time. Okay, so Hack Upstate a couple years ago, we were, Crescenzi and I, you guys have met Crescenzi, I think, right? A few weeks ago. So Crescenzi and I were there, and we were actually chatting with Jordan Gus from Density, so one of the founders of Density, and another guy, Dan Viao. I don't know if you guys have met yet. But they were playing around with Ethereum. They actually had an Ethereum line across town that we checked out, and they were just explaining to us what this whole thing was about, and we'd heard of it. In fact, I had owned Bitcoin a while ago that I had gotten rid of and regret. But we kind of fell down this proverbial rabbit hole. Like we just got pulled in and wanted to learn everything we could after we talked to them. So fast forward a few months later, Crescenzi and I, we started writing code and just like messing around. We built this like little rudimentary game just to make sure we could do it and make sure we understood what we were doing to some sense, or to some extent. And then we started contributing to open source. We thought that would be a good way to get experience and kind of carve our teeth. So there's this awesome project called Open Zeppelin, and it's open source. Most of the team that started this is based in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and they're a great, very talented group. And what they've built is a library of smart contracts that are secure and have been gone through like rigorous penetration tests to make sure that they're secure. And they're basically like, hey, instead of just going and writing that smart contract you were going to build from scratch, use ours because it's secure. We know it's secure. The code quality is first rate, all that good stuff. So we started to contribute to that and learned a ton from working with those guys. In fact, we still contribute today. We have one of our interns is in fact contributing code to the project like as we speak a few hours ago. So then after we had that experience and we felt comfortable enough, that's when we started to look for opportunities to work with different clients. So we didn't start working with a client until maybe, I want to say like April or May of last year. So it hasn't been that long that we've been doing like paid client work in this space. And since then, we've primarily worked with startups for the most part. We haven't, so I mentioned earlier, like our ideal customer is like an enterprise customer, maybe a few hundred people, ideally like Fortune 1000, where they can bring us on for an extended period of time and we can augment their engineering team. We haven't found that yet in this space. So we're still primarily working with startups that are getting stuff off the ground, trying to raise money and do that whole thing, which is fine. It's fun, but it's not like our ideal scenario. So we're still working on that. But we've worked on some really cool stuff. We worked on a platform for tokenizing securities, which is pretty crazy. A company actually out of Buffalo, they're called PrefLogic. We definitely encourage you guys to check them out. We worked with this game company called Decentraland, which is this blockchain-based virtual reality thing. Very cool too. So we've worked on some fun stuff, and we're working with a cool team out in Seattle right now. We actually just finished building smart contracts for, and don't tell, this is under NDA, so don't tell anybody, but, oh yeah, I'm live, well, whatever, they don't mind. But it's a tool that will allow political campaigns to raise Ethereum-based contributions in a legal and auditable way. So we just wrapped that up the other day, at least the smart contract for it. So where's the future of this space going? I have no idea. Like, I honestly have no idea. And I don't know where we are. I know it's not going anywhere. Like, this technology is not leaving or going away anytime soon. Governments are going to fight like crazy and try to regulate it. And I think there's we got to find a middle ground there. I'm one of these people that we need some regulation, but we don't want to stifle innovation at the same time. So I'm kind of in that camp. There's some people in the space that are like totally radical libertarians, I guess would be the best way to phrase it. And they just want governments nowhere near this stuff. And they see it as like a weapon against government intervention. So you'll find all sorts of camps and kind of sects within the space. But honestly, guys, I have no idea where it's going, and kind of the time trajectory. A lot of people like to bring up that whole thing with, remember when the internet was first getting some momentum, right? And we're like, we had bulletin boards, in the 80s maybe? And then AOL came around. Yeah, I'm dating myself. And then, AOL came around and, the World Wide Web and all that stuff. So people like to speculate like the blockchain space is like the early 90s, right? We're kind of like right on the cusp, a few years out. Honestly, I don't know. I have no idea. Have you guys, Facebook just released a coin? Have you guys heard about this?
I heard about that.
Yeah, so I have mixed thoughts on that. I think it's good in that like they're pumping resources in the space and they're going to be challenged by government like crazy. So if they want to, fork over billions of dollars to fight that fight, by all means. But it is, I would argue, a little bit centralized, which is somewhat, we were joking about it beforehand.
Like, what's the other one? Ripple? It's
Ripple,
like
yeah.
All the banks got together and like, we have a blockchain too.
Yeah, it's kind of a racket in that sense.
Morgan has one, a lot of them.
Yeah. So who knows how this space shakes out, but the fundamental blockchain technology is not going anywhere. In fact, I think we'll get to a point where it's basically transparent to all of us. Like we have no idea that it's there operating under the hood, but we trust it. Like we trust those transactions that we're making. And I also think we're going to see a lot of scenarios where we have devices communicating with other devices on the blockchain, like even cars communicating with gas stations to buy gas, and those transactions just being automated on the blockchain, like crazy sci-fi stuff like that. I do see playing out longer term. But again, I really don't know. But we're having fun with it and certainly riding that wave.
Well, I was just.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
I can't help being contrary, I guess, today.
Please.
But,
well, you're an attorney by trade, right?
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
a
so
prosecutor,
it
so we
makes
always
sense.
think the worst of people.
Yeah.
To be fair, we're usually right, so, at least professionally. If Bitcoin were to become an established and accepted cryptocurrency, the United States would be screwed completely because the dollar is the reserve currency.
Yep.
So we would definitely lose. I mean, that's one of the things that allows us to have this global dominance.
Yep.
Because everybody else has to hold dollars in reserve.
Yep.
So I'm sure the United States will fight tooth and nail.
Yeah, no doubt. And we talked about these miners, right? And the ones with all this processing power. The vast majority of that quote unquote hashing power is what it's called, is in China. Huge risk to the United States unequivocally. So not only the concerns about just fiat currency and like what that means to the US dollar, but also the fact that, all of this mining power, well, all of it, the vast majority of it is in China. So is that truly decentralized? I don't know, that's subjective.
I can guarantee you that DARPA right now is working on probably several cryptocurrency projects, which would, have all kinds of other schemes to do sort of what the Fed does, but have rules that give people trust that it's not just a fiat currency and so forth.
Yeah.
I guarantee you that they've been working on that for a long time.
I mean, I'm sure they are. I mean, obviously, if you could bypass governments, good Lord. I mean, that's like what legions of tax attorneys and accountants are there for. So if you could just do it, that would really hurt governments all around the world. But by the same token, government does stuff.
Yep.
Like provides a way for you to resolve disputes. Because like this case, I just looked up Quadriga. Have you ever heard of that?
I haven't, no.
So it was in Canada, and I long about straight. I don't remember all the details, but basically, this guy had the keys to the wallet, this is a crypto key.
Yep.
And then he is thought to have died. Some people believe he didn't die. Some people think he did. They can't really prove it.
I
I don't know if lost at sea. I don't remember the details. But anyway, so now they think his widow is spending the money, and it sounds like a huge intrigue.
Yeah.
But there's no avenue.
There's no recourse.
Money's gone.
Yeah.
It's just gone. There's no recourse.
There's so many stories like that in
Yeah.
the space right now.
I'm sure.
There's just a lot of, it's the wild west right now. It really is. And it's crazy. To combat against some of that, and again, for the I'll be quick, but there's these things called multi-sig wallets.
Mhm.
Crescenzi and I built one before where for us to issue a transaction to do something, I need to sign off on it, and then she needs to sign off on it. We both have to, otherwise it can't happen. So you could set up like a multi-sig wallet in the event that someone, were to pass away, where you only need 3 out of 4 people to sign off on it or something like that. But there's still risk, right?
Yeah, but you can still have fun.
100%. Yeah, nothing's perfect. But long story short, I think much of this space and how it plays out, it's going to have to be a balance between regulation and technology and innovation. Kind of where that middle ground is, I have no idea.
So you think Libra will take off?
What is it? Oh, Libra. What I should do is I'll send you guys. There's this thought leader in the space. This guy Eric Voorhees. I think his company is called Shapeshift. I'd argue he's a libertarian for sure. He's sensible in that, like, he can carry a conversation and like make good arguments. So he has a nice thread where he kind of breaks down the good and the bad about this in a pretty unbiased way, I would argue. I don't know where it's going. I think it's good that this massive global international company is investing time, effort, energy in the space. Like, that's a great sign. But as Gus and I were alluding to earlier, it's the way it's presented today is centralized. Like, you could spend $1 million and stand up a node. I don't know how many people want to do that. It's a select few. So we'll kind of have to wait and see long term how it all shakes out.
How do you get Bitcoin?
You can buy it on an exchange.
Uh-huh.
The most famous and trusted one is called Coinbase, but there's a bunch of them. So you could buy Bitcoin, you could buy whatever cryptocurrency you're looking for, most often through these exchanges. Cool, guys. Anything else? Sure.
So you mentioned that you guys are still looking for kind of the ideal client when it comes to Ethereum.
Yeah.
Say you guys find that and get it all set up and going, would you consider expanding to other cryptocurrencies, or do you guys like Ethereum forever?
No, we're going to go where developers go. We went to Ethereum because it had the largest developer community, and the best documentation. But yeah, we'll jump ship if something comes along and it's awesome.
Facebook has a lot of good developers, and they're really good at documentation.
Yeah.
They have a lot going for theirs just on that alone.
Yeah.
But then there's like the sort of philosophical, it's not Facebook that controls it, but it's a small group of people, a partnership, like MasterCard and, several other people, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway.
But to answer, we'll go where the developers go, and so we're not married to Ethereum. We're married to the potential power of blockchain and what value we could introduce to clients when it comes to utilizing it.
So what are some of the other applications aside from currency? Because when you read the Internet of Money, it's like, oh, Bitcoin is just the start of it. I haven't finished it, so I don't know what the other applications are.
Yeah, so sometimes it's just data transactions, right?
Mhm.
Sending email. Yeah, just validating that Jacques sent that email to me. I mean, you could do it with like anything. Anything that needs trust, I would say. So any transaction that's going to require a trust relationship to verify it, any scenario like that would be a viable use case for it. Anything else, guys? Yeah.
Do you have any resources if people are interested in learning how to?
Yes, good question. So we, on our GitHub, we have like this intranet for our company, and we have probably dozens of assets and resources, like tutorials and stuff. I'd be happy to share that. Just copy and paste and share it over to you guys.
Cool.
Yeah.
Question for like tech news, what are some good places for that?
For just tech news in general, or like blockchain news and
Just in general.
you're asking the wrong guy.
Recode daily. I get an email from them.
Yeah, I used to go to Hacker News a lot. I haven't been there in a while.
Hacker News is still around. Programming Reddit's good. Hacker News is really good. It's just a chat, it's sort of a bulletin board or forum or whatever. Yeah.
Is that like coding or like things?
It's like just kind of like tech stuff. It's very funny, like how sort of like typecast a lot of the content and the stories are. Like a lot of it is like anything with the combination of like blockchain, Rust these days.
Rust, AI.
Yeah, like some kind of quirky like electronics from the 80s. That like it's very much like a very hipster kind of community in a lot of sense. They like a lot of fads.
Yeah. But you'll find anything from like.
Not that Rust is bad or blockchain.
But you'll find anything from like entrepreneurial stuff on there, mostly tech centric, and also programming heavy, or even like hardware hobby. It's good for that sort of thing. It's not going to read like a periodical, like a Wired. It'll point you to different articles and white papers and things like that. But to be honest with you, Takir, I don't really glance at too much stuff, so that's probably my
If you're talking about just like the Facebook stuff or like that kind of news, I just skim them basically, but I do keep up pretty well. At least I know that there's a thing with it, even if I don't understand it.
Anything else, guys? Cool. Well, thanks so much, guys. Again, if you want to learn more about this, just flag me down. I'm happy to schedule an opportunity to sync up and drill deeper. So let me know. All right, guys. Thank you.
All right. So I think we might want to do this like factories thing like in a couple weeks, because I'll be back for one more week. And today I've got a whole bunch of more stuff to talk about, which is also a little bit intellectual and taking some time for this. So are you?
I don't have anything else. Stop the stream and then start a new one, just so it'll capture as a new video. But I'm all good. I got nothing.
Okay. Well, we could like in 5 minutes we could pop in and yeah, let's do that. Okay. Thank you, Doug.